got my instructions. See, even the panels get smaller at this time of night, you know? I mean, it's like, you know, it's just even the survival of the panelists, you know, just hardy. A few of us. So when I was thinking about what to talk about here, you know, I started pulling out some old stuff to read. So this one is from Nick Salvatore, the great historian at Cornell. Decline of Labor, a grim picture, a few proposals. Well, you know, where's my Sinai tablet now? So that's 1992, right? That Nick is writing this. And he does have one good proposal, which I'm going to get to, and which a lot of people have touched on here, and which is almost even more important the smaller the labor movement gets. So I think broadly, the task is to bring back, and this is a big task, I think, to bring back a version of what used to be called the labor question. People know that. I mean, there's a couple of actual ringers here, historians. They know what the labor question is. But the labor question was actually this huge deal from like the late 19th century through about 1940, where, like, you know, if you were running for president, and if you could imagine there were televised debates then, which of course there weren't, people would ask you about the labor question. Like William Jennings Bryan ran 3 times. He talked about the labor question every time. Woodrow Wilson, when he gave his State of the Union, it was a message back then, they didn't actually go and talk. In 1919, the Congress said the question which stands at the front of all others is the question of labor. How are the men and women who do the daily labor of the world to obtain progressive improvement? Even in 47, which is already a little late, the beginning of his State of the Union address, which he did speak before Congress, the biggest domestic issue in 47 was labor management relations. The biggest foreign one was Cold War, right? But number one, labor management relations. Of course, 10% of the workforce of the United States had gone on strike in 1946. So that was kind of a big deal. That would be equivalent of like 14 million today in 1 year. So just wrap your head around that. So, right, maybe we can't bring back the labor question in all of its enormous magnitude, but we talk about industrial democracy with great earnestness, and we talk about the connection between working people and politics, economics, and even culture. You know, they had a broad-running like play on Broadway, you know, I mean, a long-running play on Broadway, The Pajama Game, about a pajama factory that was unionized in the 1950s, right? I mean, stuff like that, you know, I mean, we got Norma Ray, it's, you know, maybe we can bring all of that back, maybe not, but sort of how do we at least keep that in our head? Like thinking about what is the relationship between working people and politics, the economy, and culture, and see if we can bring that back in some way, because it was a big deal for 70 years. So I want to ask that question and probably not answer it, but I next want to sort of say what we lost. Then the big misses that we had about 40 years ago, there are 2, I think. And then sort of why maybe things are slightly better now and, you know, not so, I don't know, what did this guy say, a grim picture? Maybe it's slightly less grim per some of the discussion today, but still, you know, a heavy lift. So what was lost? I mean, we sort of all know it, like people sort of say it and sort of quickly move past it. Globalization, deindustrialization, that's like 50, 70 million workers worldwide, like in the advanced countries. I mean, you need to sort of, like, in a way, it shouldn't depress us. We should be more like the 5-year-old kids playing soccer, like everybody gets a medal for just, we're all good just to be pushing through this. I mean, this was the most powerful, you know, left-wing working class force in history, and it empowered working people all over the advanced world. And it's not just us. Like everybody here has talked today about, the American labor movement and Reagan and Pasco, blah, 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 blah. The entire Western world, the labor movement has declined in the last 60 years. And by the way, it's not 30 years it's declined here, it's 60, all right, since the mid-50s. But it declined everywhere. When we were at 34%, the Brits were over 60% union density. Okay, now they're at 25. That's almost as big a decline. Germany, which has probably, arguably, the most powerful labor movement in the world, 20 years ago, it was at a third union density. Now it's at 18%. I mean, the French, their contracts cover like 90%, which is, obviously unthinkable to us. But actual members is only like 7% something. Spain is 7%. There's only 5 countries in the world that have over 50% union density, and 4 out of the 5, they run the unemployment insurance levels for their unemployment insurance programs for their countries. So it's kind of like a captive market. Like, they're never going to decline that much, mostly Scandinavian countries and Austria. So this was everybody with this decline. Everybody in the advanced world, because as Eric Hobsbawm, the great British Marxist historian, said, all these workers just disappeared. They retired. They went to developing countries. Their productivity increased, so there's less of them we need in the United States. So like in the early 70s, when you had like steel at 1.1 million members, Gary Hubbard, oh, I guess he left. Gary Hubbard for the steel workers, you might know this. But, okay, so that's 1.1 million members driving the middle class, right? Along with the UAW. And yes, coded white male. We're talking about manufacturing and mining workers, right? Just white men, default status, they don't have to think about their identity because they're white men, almost overwhelmingly, okay? But white men with a hell of a lot of power, and some of that power trickled out, okay? So think about 1.1 million in the early 70s, like the union for steel workers. They weren't all steel workers, most of them were, some aluminum workers. So how many steel workers, union and non-union, like people who work in steel mills, do we have in the United States today? Anybody want to take a guess? Like 40 years later. 100, what? No, that's, yeah, I guess I set it up so it would be incredibly low. It is incredibly low, but it's not that incredibly low. 150,000, okay? The union itself had 1 million members. This is 150,000 union and non-union, and they're never coming back. So hold on to the idea of how much power was lost there, economic power and political power. Political power in the Democratic Party, and again, all over the West. Political power in all the labor parties of Western Europe and Canada. I mean, they're better than we are, but they went way down too before they flattened out. So power is lost, but also institutional and historical consciousness is lost, okay? So you think of like the mine workers. I mean, when John L. Lewis for about 10 years was the second most powerful man in the country, the reason, it wasn't because he was a nice man, he was like an incredible prick, right? Truman, like, hated, in fact, most of America, according to the polls back then, hated him. But the reason he was the second most powerful man in the country was because he had a union of 400,000 mine workers who controlled 65 to 70% of all the energy in the country. And he could just shut down, like, the lights, right? Well, now we have like 15,000 mine workers, maybe. And of course, they're never coming back, and for good reason, for climate change. It just can't have that. Sub-Saharan Africa needs coal, but aside from that, you can't have mine workers anymore at these levels. Otherwise, we're just going to incinerate the planet. So, but we lost something with that. Everybody understood that mine workers and their communities were absolutely solidarity, right? 100%. And that conveyed a message to the country, that these, mostly guys, but supported by their entire communities, would do anything to support each other. This is what social solidarity meant. And they're gone now. They can't present that message to us anymore. So we have to rebuild that from scratch. So here's what we lost in 2.5 minutes, and here's what we sort of need to gain. We had 2 big misses, right? And one of them was discussed earlier by Leo, I think. Like, CIO tries to organize the South in 1947, gets killed, and puts huge amount of resources in it for that time period, like $1 million real money, 250 staff, best organizer in the CIO, gets killed. You know, it gets red-baited, race-baited, you know, too early, right? I mean, right, we can't pick our moment, as Joe McCartan said, but too early. Because what you needed to do, and this was totally freaking the South out for like 30 years, between the mid-30s and the mid-60s, and beyond, was combined labor and the African-American civil rights movement. Because so much of the power of white supremacy in the South had to do with like a wage system designed to like exploit and terrorize black and white workers and enrich Southern urban elites. So if you combine them, if we could have figured out how to do that in the early to mid-60s, then it wouldn't have been just maybe a civil rights bill and a voting rights act, which were incredible in themselves, but maybe a new labor act too, maybe a new Wagner Act. But we missed it. And look, I mean, obviously some unions were very supportive, but you know, you weren't going to have somebody like George Meany pull that off. You weren't going to have basically the white man who ran the American labor movement sort of conceptualize that. That's tragic. Second time was the early 70s, okay? And think about why this happened, and this is why I'm slightly hopeful for today. The early 70s, all kinds of incredible stuff happens. Like, I mean, a lot of, well, I guess the young people are hardier, so that's why they stuck around. Like, basically in 1970, I mean, there was like a postal strike. It was a wildcat strike of the Postal Service. Like, not announced by the leadership. We loved the leadership. We talked about the leadership. We had leadership here earlier today. Is there any left? No, they're too smart for that. They went off to lead. But look, it was a wildcat strike. I mean, 200,000 postal workers. It starts in New York City. It spreads from city to city. People talk about, you know, whatever, Facebook. I mean, bless it, it's great. You know, Twitter. I don't know. You know, they didn't have that stuff. It spread. They said, fuck you, we're striking. I mean, Nixon had to bring out the National Guard. I mean, he didn't bust them the way Paco did because he thought he could figure out a way to get to white workers. So he wanted to not bust them the way Reagan did with Paco. But that's amazing. Wildcat strike. 400,000 GM workers go on strike in 70. In 72, Lordstown, Ohio, the fastest auto assembly line in the history of the world. 3-week strike costs GM $150 million, which is even real money now. J.P. Stevens, Farrer boycott. Wrap up. Okay. So we missed that too. We missed that because, but here's the hopeful thing. We missed it because basically a huge recession, 74, 75, and it breaks the back of the whole thing and it doesn't spread. But why was that hopeful for today? It's hopeful for today because those people, those workers who were pissed off and striking in the early 70s, they came out of the 60s movements. They were Vietnam vets. They were women who had become radicalized by feminism. They were African Americans who had become radicalized by the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, okay? Those, just broader social movements connected with our labor movement and fed it. And sometimes it works that way and sometimes the other way, where workers feed into the broader social movement. And that's what we need to do today, and that's why I'm more hopeful. Because we see, as people discuss, we see something sort of coming up, you know, post-Ferguson. And we see, you know, our $15 an hour minimum wage stuff and you know, our retail work stuff. And we need to connect to people who are just generally pissed off about authority. And that's what happened in the 60s leading to 70 strikes. And when it happens big. We don't know how to spread it. If we did, you know, we would. But that's what happened in 1877, railroad strike. They even have telephones. You know, 1876, the telephone was invented, right? So there weren't any telephones, but it still spread. So it can happen today with all the social tools we have. So, I mean, I'm not saying it will, but maybe.